And it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Chris Edgar, today. Chris is currently a research assistant professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Forest Resources in the U.S. Forest Service. He's also the Director of Graduate Studies of the NRSM program, graduate program here. Before coming to Minnesota, Chris was at Texas A&M Forest Service, and before that at Humboldt State, now Cal Poly Humboldt. He got his PhD in the NRSM program, a master's here at University of Minnesota in the forestry program, so was here for that transition, and a bachelor's degree from North Carolina State in forestry. His research focuses on measurement and description of forests, urban forest inventory, disturbance estimation and analysis. And when asked, I actually asked, but I had already guessed Chris's favorite spring activity, which is baseball.
Well, thank you. I'm going to talk today about one of my major research threads, and kind of give you a sense of what I've been working on since I joined the department back in 2017, at least a portion of this thread. So I really got three studies that I was going to just kind of give you an overview of, which kind of show progression of work that I've done, starting thinking about really methods and techniques of using national forest inventory data to assess disturbance, and then transitioning from my focus on southern forest and then moving up to the northern forest here, and culminating in an application of some of these ideas to Laurentian Mixed Forest, a recent paper that we published. So that's kind of the outline for the talk. So when I came up here in 2017, I was, as Rebecca noted, really kind of a split here between the University of Minnesota for teaching and then the Northern Research Station Forest Inventory Analysis program for my research focus. And so coming up here and starting this job, I'd actually just done a lot of work on disturbance estimation, because Texas has lots of disturbances and hurricanes and droughts and things, as you'll see here in a minute. And needing to get started on some research threads, I thought, well, I'll continue on this idea of thinking about disturbance and how we can understand disturbance better. And I just wanted to point out here, I mean, I really think of two primary sources of data on disturbance. Obviously, remote sensing is a very important one, very strong when it comes to the spatial and temporal scale. And then really starting to see some really nice papers published in terms of attributing what they're seeing in that data to cause agent and what's causing this disturbance. But another very important data set is the National Forest Inventory. And in particular here in the United States, the National Forest Inventory is administered by the Forest Inventory Analysis Program, which is the program that I'm doing most of my research focuses on. So seemed like a good thing to jump into, given everything that's been going on in the US in terms of disturbances that we hear so much about. So that said, let's take a look at the first study, which was, again, when I got here in 2017, I had Texas on my mind a lot. Minnesota was not quite on my mind yet, let alone the whole northern research area. So I was very familiar with the Texas data and had actually done quite a bit of work on disturbance estimation already. And so I decided to jump into the FIA data to say, help me to learn it better, but also then to really think about how can I leverage the FIA data to understand how multiple disturbances, large-scale disturbances that have occurred actually fairly rapidly in time, and use the FIA data to understand how those disturbances have affected the forest. And so the study area here was East Texas, which is, actually a very significant timber area. I think over $21 billion in direct economic input from the timber forestry sector to the state. So very substantial timber base there. This is very much looks like a lot of the Southeast as a whole in terms of forest-based. East Texas does. So as it turns out, there was a hurricane. This preceded my time in Texas. This is before I arrived, but in 2005, Hurricane Rita came through this timber base. And we can just see here the general zones with the largest impact, the most severe class here, centered on Orange County, and then just radiating to the west and the north. just different severity classes of impact. This hit in September 24th in terms of total damage and affected timber based upon a rapid damage assessment that the Texas A&M Forest Service did was almost 800,000 acres affected or damaged. 967 million cubic feet, which is about 6% of all the volume in East Texas, and estimated stumpage value, just kind of a calculation of that volume times stumpage prices, $833 million. So pretty severe event. Well, just a few years later, they had another hurricane come through, and this one focused in here. We didn't see the most severe class that we saw, but again, kind of coming up here through just east of Houston. Here kind of focused on Liberty County and running north, but you can see not quite to the same scale as Hurricane Rita, but still a very substantial disturbance just 3 years apart. And then in 2011, Texas had its worst one-year drought in recorded history. And this figure right here is one of my favorites. It comes from a publication out of the Journal of Climate. And each dot here represents a summer. So June, July, August weather data. And on the x-axis, we have precipitation. And on the y-axis, we have temperature, and it's deviations from the average. And so what we see here is cooler, wetter here in this quadrant, hotter, drier in the upper quadrant. That's the 2011 drought. So you see a figure like this and you realize just how exceptional that event was when you plot it against over 100-year time horizon of what summers are typically like, which were already very hot and warm. So this was very much on my mind because I had done I was actually here when this happened and was in charge of doing a very large statewide survey of drought mortality. And we estimated, at least the East Texas portion, that the 66 million trees died in that drought, which is about 4% of all trees in East Texas, just outright killed from the drought. And as you moved more northerly and more westerly within East Texas, the severity of the impacts increased. So, so these three events were very much on my mind as I started thinking about. So what can we say has happened to the forest resources using FIA data, knowing that it takes several years after an event for the FIA data to start to roll in the way the FIA data is collected. And so it's about this time when I came here that we started to get real substantial post-disturbance data from the FIA data set for me to take a look at. So the methods that I use, again, as I've already noted, forest inventory analysis data. I limited this analysis to publicly available data. So this is data that all of you can download from the resources that FIA provides. And I use the standard estimation procedures. So we're not using any alternative kind of estimators that might mean more than is necessary for this talk, but just really using kind of the standard estimation procedures with one little change in how I did that. And we'll see what kind of insight we get with that one change into looking at the impacts of the disturbance. So just as a quick, get you up to date on how the FIA data collection works. It's an annual survey. And we divide all the plots in a state into what we call panels. And in Texas, we have 5 panels. And we start off by measuring one panel, in this case, 2001. And then we go measure this, so all new locations, or what's panel 2 plots, were measured in 2002. So you can see it took 5 years to get through and get all the initial plots measured. And then the process just repeats. So in 2006, we go back to panel A, which was originally measured in 2001. And we measure those plots again in 2006. Then we start to get the change components. We can do things like growth removals and mortality with 2 points in time. So when we go to build an estimate using kind of the standard FIA procedures, we use an approach that's called temporally indifferent. We combine all the panels together, and that's what's depicted here. And so you can see in terms of a first year of an estimate would be 2005 is when we had all the panels measured. That last panel was measured in 2005, and now we're ready to produce kind of the first official estimate with all the data in it. And then in 2006, we remeasure the first panel, and I'm just showing, so in 2006, we can get an updated estimate. But what you'll notice there is 80% of the data is the same in consecutive years, because it's just a fifth of the data gets refreshed every year. And so this creates some unique features in the estimates when you look at estimates over time, like 2005 to 16. And that can have important implications when we're thinking about disturbance impacts. So these are kind of the standard estimates here. And so the particular attribute I'm focusing in on today is something simple, just number of standing dead trees. Okay, it's something that resonates with the general public as opposed to metric tons of carbon or metric tons per hectare, right? Most people can quickly grasp a tree in terms of thinking about millions of trees and how many that would be. So, and I've just, so these are the kinds of estimates you can produce from the standard online tools and just showing one standard error. So some pretty good estimates, some pretty tight bounds on those. And then I've just kind of put in when Rita occurred, when Ike occurred, and when the drought occurred in terms of thinking about, well, what can we say about the impacts of these large scale disturbance events on these estimates? And see a fairly flat pattern here, centered on Ike, but clearly the drought has had some sort of impact. We're seeing large increases in the numbers of dead trees, standing dead trees out in the forest after the drought. So let's take a look though at, remember these estimates are based on 5 years of observations. And so when you start thinking about where does the data come from that we're actually producing an estimate for? Well, in each plot that we measure in the FIA database, it's available to the public in terms of when that plot was measured by year, month, and day. And so what I did was for each set of estimates, which again is using 5 years of observations, I just classified each plot based upon was it measured basically before any disturbance. So that would be before 2005. Was it measured after Rita, but before Ike? Was it measured after Ike in this period here? And was it measured in the drought? And here's where it's important to recognize these are very distinctive disturbances. This is a very sudden, very short period of time. The drought actually got started on September 27th. That's actually right almost when I started working down in Texas. Hopefully my arrival did not cause this drought. But September 27th, a nice tropical storm moved through and then it just shut off. And there was nothing going on for quite a number of months into even years. And so the drought, even though we might measure plots around here, they still really are not really reflecting drought conditions yet. So it takes some time for the drought to really work its action on the trees. So I'm going to go back now to those basic estimates that we saw, those standard estimates. And what I'm going to do now is superimpose, try to show you where the data comes from in terms of when these plots were measured relative to these disturbances. So I'm using the same color scheme. These are the estimates, the kinds that you get from the online tools, and we see the general run up from the drought. So you can see what we call the 2005 estimate, which includes data from 2001 to 2005, about equal parts by year, is really all pre-disturbance data in terms of these three disturbances. And then we start to get some post-Rita data in the 2006 estimate and through the 7. And by the 2008 estimate, we're getting pretty close to equal parts pre and post Rita. But we never get really just an estimate that's just Rita only. Everything's always kind of a mix of when these disturbances occur so rapidly and so quickly, we have this finding here that really the estimates each year that we produce are mixtures of different times in terms of pre and post. And when you get multiple disturbances, it just exacerbates that. So what can we say about disturbance and its impacts on number of standing dead trees in Texas? So that was the kind of question that I was trying to focus in when I got to this point, and realizing this is actually a complex, it's just not a simple straight answer by looking at a fairly simple query like this. So again, I just started working with FIA a lot, and this is kind of the green book. This is the document that really lays out all the estimation techniques. I don't know if affectionately is the right word, but some refer to it as the green book because of the cover. Some might refer to it as the Green Book of Doom. But anyway, so it has lots of names. But anyway, this is where you go when you really want to try to understand the basic sample design and what. And if you go through there, actually, there's a chapter in there, the last chapter on combining panels, had just some really interesting information in it that I kind of knew about, but was not real closely familiar with. I won't pull out all the really interesting things, but this one right here really captures it. So we've looked at the standard estimation, but the design itself is actually very responsive to doing analysis when we've had these kind of events. It's just with the standard estimation tools that most people use, it's not something that's very easy to access to get those kinds of estimates. And so this is where I jumped in using the same basic standard estimation procedures, except for one change. So still very much within the Green Book approach, tried to look at, can I get some resolution on what's happening in this forest relative to the disturbances? So here's all the plots, all 5 panels of plots in East Texas, of which there's about 3,800 plots, about 1 plot for every 6,000 acres, kind of the standard grid. But again, we break all those, get broken up into 5 panels in East Texas. If you take a look at any individual panel, here's just one, you see that the sample is spatially balanced. So we actually get a sample from the population every year. And what we do in the estimation was we combined 5 of these pictures to produce this picture, and we kind of don't really take into account the time in which the plots were measured, and we call that the temporally indifferent method. But I can use the same basic estimation procedures, the same formula on just a single panel of plots. Or I could take 2 panels of plots and bring them together to double the sample size. So that's something that's actually been known, and there are some early papers in the early annual literature after the annual inventory, kind of developing some of these ideas, but I thought to apply it here and take a look at the findings, given that we have such 3 strong disturbances to see how it actually plays out. So this is really more of a case study paper that we did. And so kind of the same idea, here's the panels in which we've measured, but rather than combining 5, I'm going to start just producing estimates off a single panel every single year and see what's happening there. Now, when we look at consecutive year estimates, they don't share any data. It's all a brand new set of data until you get to 5 years later, then it's the same locations, but remeasured, which can create some issues in interpretation, but that's beyond what I want to cover. And so here is the same standing dead tree mortalities. Now I've got estimates going back to 2001 rather than starting at 2005. And here I've plotted when was the plots measured relative to disturbance. And now we get some estimates where we've got all the plots basically are measured after a single disturbance event. And so we might think, okay, I've gotten rid of some of this confounding and multiple disturbances in the estimate. And one of the things that really jumps out there is this drought impact. It's just enormous when you think about standing dead trees out there in the forest. So I'm going to take the initial estimates we saw, which are kind of the standard ones, and then here are my new ones with the single panel estimates. Okay, and here's what I'm saying. The drought had a really immediate impact. The standard estimates, as is very well known, has a, it's a lagging indicator because of this kind of rolling average idea where it combines 5 years of data. And we definitely see that playing out. But once we get to like a single panel estimation, you can really see the impact was really almost immediate the next year. So here I've just calculated the difference between these 2 estimates to see, are we really talking about things that are statistically significant? I mean, is it really worth spending the time to do this just to say it's not statistically significant? And so what you can see here is whenever you've got error bars that don't intersect 0, then yes, that's a statistically significant difference between those 2 sets of estimates. And so this is very, very strong evidence that that drought had a really huge immediate impact, but really started to subside pretty quick in terms of after a few years with the number of trees coming down in the forest. So just to wrap up this study, for Hurricane Rita, which was the 2005, did not see real strong evidence when you go and do a more detailed analysis of these results. Some evidence of a significant increase the second year, and a delayed effect seems like a possibility. And here I'm saying net change. It's important to note that I'm just looking at standing trees in a snapshot. So definitely a storm could come through and create a bunch of new stags, but also tear down or knock down a whole bunch of snags, and the net change may not be all that different. So I'm not getting at the change component here. I'm just looking at snapshots of trees in the forest by year. So I do want to make that point because it's a very important one. And with Ike, just no real strong evidence of a significant change when we did more analyses. As far as the drought, as I've mentioned, when you really start to look at these single panels, you see an immediate impact. just almost a doubling in 1 year of the number of dead trees out in the forest. And then the annual declines start pretty soon thereafter. I suppose on the basic estimate, it's still that lagging indicator that's building and building over multiple years. So that then led to some observations. The single panel estimates, which is the kind of the new approach here versus the standard approach. It's important to be thinking about when you've got really large scale disturbances, to be thinking about doing single panels. We also did a whole series of multiple panels where we did combinations, not just 1 or 5, but we did 3. And that might be important, particularly if you go out to the Western US where they're on a 10-year remeasurement cycle and have 10 panels. You very well might be wanting to combine multiple panels. It depends upon the frequency of the disturbance. It would be really nice if we could get this capability in the online tools. It's not too difficult to do if you have gone through the Green Book and programmed all that. There's nothing really difficult from my perspective, but it is something that's just not generally accessible for most people. So it would be good to think about including some of this capability in some of our online tools. And then this is another point that's getting maybe more detailed I want to, but we did a lot of significance testing, and the change in stratifications created some issues, but I probably should have deleted that. So lots of findings in that paper. I'm just really covering the main things here. Okay, so the second study, so that was 2019 when we got that published. And then I was having a conversation with a U.S. Forest Service colleague from the Southern Research Station. And it was clear that he was thinking a lot about disturbance and disturbance estimation, and doing so at kind of a deeper level than me. So it was really, really good to talk to him and hear some of his ideas. And then that led to a collaboration, and that included a few more people, and then I'll cover here in that study too. And so that's how to think about appropriate approaches to the estimation of forest disturbance. And here we're talking about the timing and extent, how much area was disturbed and when did that actually occur, from retrospective observations and panelized forest inventory designs. So I'll talk about what a retrospective observation is, but I think you probably have a sense of what a panelized forest inventory design is. That's an annual where we measure a portion of the plots every year. It's not just the United States that does that. Other countries use a very similar approach for their national forest inventories too. So in the FIA, we observe on each forested plot the presence of disturbances and what we call treatments. So treatments would be more like silvicultural things, cutting, those kinds of things. Disturbances, we'll talk about what they are. We note if they've occurred, and they need to meet some sort of minimum threshold in terms of damage or mortality, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We note the agent, the year in which the disturbance or treatment occurred. And it's not just one disturbance, but we record up to 3 different disturbances on each condition. So we can have multiple disturbances occurring, and those would get recorded up to 3. So here is the panelized inventory, and this is the real insight that my co-author, John Colston, really brought forth in this paper, and I think so, it is a very important one. And it's how to think about determining an estimate for how much disturbance occurred in an actual year. Because as you've seen with this lagging indicator that combines data from multiple years, the time element can get a little confusing in terms of what time period are we actually talking about here. But with this recognition here, that really what we're talking about is a retrospective observation of disturbance. When we go and visit a plot, the disturbances are noted from the previous measurement. Okay, so in a 5-panel system like this, that would be in the previous 5 years. Those would get recorded as long with the year and agent. And so when we look at a 5-panel inventory where the first panel was measured in 5, and then panel 2 and measured it and then measured again in 9. So first of all 4 and then 9, and then you can see and panel 2 was measured in 2010, and it's going to look at disturbances for the preceding 5 years. And when you start to do this very simple little diagram here, you begin to realize actually it's only this year that we have a complete observation of disturbance for that year. Every other year in which we might want to estimate how much occurred that year, it's actually we don't have the full sample size. And so in this case, we could combine the panels from 2009 to 13 And it would be this 2009 would be the 1 year where we have the full sample size. To do estimates for these other years, how much disturbance actually occurred in those other years, we would need to do some sort of effective sampling size change to account for the fact that we've got some panels where it's not observed. And that was an important insight. So in this study, we did 2 estimation approaches. We did the kind of the basic post-stratified estimation, the standard approach. And then my co-author developed this weight-adjusted post-stratified, or WAPS estimator, doing this effective sample size recognition on the idea of the retrospective observation. We got known populations with disturbance using satellite imagery data sources. A lot of good work's been done now to think about getting at the agent on the disturbances and some of these key remote sensing data sources. So we basically had the true value, how much disturbance occurred in those states across these years. And so then we could then simulate laying down a grid, the FIA grid, randomly locating plots, intersecting it with the remote sensing to see if the proportion of the plots that were disturbed, and then going through the standard estimation approach, seeing what the estimate is, and then comparing it to what we know the true value to be in this case. And for each state, we did 20,000 replicates of this simulation. So we're getting 20,000 estimates each year. And we can see how that varies compared to the true value. The 3 populations we looked at were California, the northern interior portion, where we looked at fire. And there was not much fire in the first few years, and then fire really jumped up starting around 2008. They had a really big fire outbreak. And then we looked at harvesting in Maine, and we looked at harvesting in southern Arkansas. And so you can see harvesting in Arkansas had the highest rates of disturbance, if we actually a treatment in FIA speak, but we're thinking of it just as a disturbance here. So those are the 3 populations where we had the true values of how much area was disturbed in each of the years covered. So this is probably the most complicated figure in the whole talk. So take a few minutes. So Arkansas, California, Maine, so we can simplify and just look at one for right now, or maybe forever. And then year. So this is disturbance year, when our estimate of how much disturbance occurred in 2002, 3, 4, up to 2010. And then this line right here is the true value, again, off of our simulated population using remote sensing. And we have our traditional estimator, the post-stratified estimation. So you can see the estimate here. This is the interquartile range. That box, this is just the box and whiskers of the 20,000 simulations. And you can see here is the true value, and here is our estimate. So we are significantly below the true value when it comes to estimating using this data, 2002. But if you go and you take a look, you can see that 1 year where every single point, every single plot would have observed disturbance in that particular year, the 1 year where that occurred, we actually get a pretty good estimate. And so, and then as we move further away from that, we begin to see, using the traditional estimation approach, we begin to see again this increasing bias in our estimates. So the particular approach that was developed was this effective sample size change, or what we call the WAPS method, and it actually did a pretty good job of getting corresponding pretty well with the true value. So the WAPS method provides some methodology if you want to use all the panels, how to do the adjustment to get appropriate estimates. They're still a little biased. It's more detail we want to get into. FIA is not a rare event survey, so there's always a little bit of something going on there. But much better estimates, except for that single year where every single panel observed disturbance in that given year. You can use the traditional method. And this repeats here for California. As I said, there was very little disturbance in the first few years and then a big, and you can see the WAPS method captured the correct value pretty well. And then here's harvesting in Maine, very similar ideas and results. So we now have some methodology that we can actually get to estimates of the actual timing of events. The last thing we did in this paper was a case study. Again, going back to my Texas, just familiarity with that data. We went to East Texas again. And as you noticed in the first paper, right, we had hurricanes Rita in 2005, Hurricane Ike in 2008, and we had the drought in 2011. And so we just hypothesized, all right, if this approach is really working, we would expect three large bumps in 2005, 8, and 11 to correspond with those events. And when we ran the estimates, that's indeed what popped out. And so that was like, okay, good confirmation that we're on the right method here. So we now have some methodology that lets us use this data rather than using this lagging indicator, which is quite common. And still, I mean, again, in many cases, the standard approaches works great because things in the forest aren't changing a whole lot. And so the whole idea of having to keep this temporal is not really something that's worth putting the time into if the attribute is not changing rapidly. It's just in these events that I was going to say rare, but seem to be more and more common lately, of really large disturbances that are changing things drastically, is where we need to begin thinking about leveraging the basic capacity that's built into the design, which, the people who designed it put, it was a really good idea to have this panelization. Provides a lot of opportunity, but there's just some barriers that make it difficult to do for most people that we need to be thinking about. So, yeah, appropriate estimation of timing extent of disturbance requires care. This is not something that's easy to do. You got to be real careful. Be very familiar with the database and the estimation formula and things like that. The weight adjusted post-stratified estimates provide satisfactory agreement with known values and simulated populations. So they do a pretty good job. And so definitely don't have the degree of bias that we saw in the standard methodology, except for that one single year where we have all the observations. All right, so study 3. So that was 2020 when we got that study published. And this is a study that we just got published last year, so 2022, and it's really utilizing ideas from both these papers and just taking this methodology and applying it to Laurentian Mixed Forest and seeing what we can say about disturbance in the Laurentian Mixed Forest. So motivation for this, I was looking at the Northern Forest Futures Project, and which was published back in 2016, and noted there about unprecedented forest health threats occurring across the northern United States. So yes, the northern United States is experiencing many large-scale and unprecedented disturbances like other parts, not just Texas and California and those places, but we've got some major events going on in the north, according to the Northern Forest Futures Project, plus research that colleagues of mine over at Northern Research Station have done, emerald ash borer and species like that. We have our own faculty here who have done silvicultural surveys, and one of the free-form questions, at least one of the earlier surveys, people were noting that how they're really thinking about forest health and resilience and wanting to manage for forest health and resilience. Obviously, that's a concern because of forest health and concern about disturbances. I mean, at one level, disturbances are creating to that concern. And so while a company or an agency might know fairly well what's going on their lands exist in a larger matrix of, you've probably seen the checkerboard pattern of ownership in Minnesota. It's a complex ownership pattern in Minnesota with, and so, one thing that would be very helpful, I think, is to have some general, what's happening regionally in terms of disturbances, and knowing that your lands are one part of that, but what's happening more broadly, not just your lands, but beyond. And that's a great use of the National Forest Inventory, those kinds of regional broad scale estimates. And so it also, right around this time, I think I was at the Society of American Foresters conference. I think it was Louisville, if I remember correctly, and I was actually speaking with a local forester here in Minnesota, and they were describing to me that when they sit down to do their harvest scheduling and they have broader discussions within the interest groups within their agency company slash in terms of whom they were working with, that there's been a lot of discussion in those meetings about forest disturbance. And in fact, this particular person noted that people were going to the FIA online tools and running all kinds of queries and producing estimates of disturbance, and then using that as they were having their discussions about which stands should be harvested, their actual stand selections. So, from that discussion, it really came across as, it's to get a little confusing with all these estimates in terms of what's really happening in the forest. So I thought, okay, well, this might be something I can do to benefit forest managers in the state, to provide some perspective on disturbance. It was also around this time that other colleagues here in the department, David Wilson and Alan Eck and Lee Freilich, published a paper showing really a lot of disturbance in Minnesota's forest, and so that was also on my mind and thinking about applying these methods. So with that conversation with the forester, I was like, I've got the methodology for you. So let me work on that, and this is the culmination of that. So the study area, I broadened it out to the Laurentian Mixed Forest, just trying not to thinking broadly about the northern upper Great Lakes area. The FIA plot network is very extensive up here. In fact, Minnesota, as many of you know, doubles the intensity of the sample, so really good on a 5-year cycle. Michigan and Wisconsin too. We've got all that data. They're part of the broad network, and here's just the number of plots and number of forested plots. And across the whole Laurentian Mixed Forest, we're talking about 64 acres of total area. And depending upon the year that we look at, between 41 to 43 million acres of forest. So obviously a very heavily forested area in the northern tiers of Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. I think many of you know this, but forest types are quite diverse. Aspen birch is predominant here with about 26% of the forest types, followed by maple beech birch, and then we get into some of the conifers, spruce fir, oak hickory, white red jack pine. And there's actually 10 additional groups that account for 12% of the rest. Also diverse by ownership, as I was mentioning, the diverse ownership patterns in the state. So a fairly even split between public and private across the Laurentian Mixed Forest. And what's one thing that's unique here is the 3 public agencies have contribute a lot of forest land or manage a lot of forest land between state, federal, and county. In the FIA database, in the field protocols, if you go through and take a look at those, there's 28 disturbances. So again, they visit a plot. If it's forested, they'll send someone out to go look at the plot. And since the last survey, determine if there's been a disturbance. And if it has, they're looking for, I've not written them all out. It'd be a long list of 28, but 3 different kinds of insects, trees, shrubs, diseases, fire, crown, brown, or a combination of both. Different animals, beaver, deer, ungulate, weather, and I think you can imagine what those would be: ice, drought, flooding, things like that, non-beaver flooding, vegetation, unknown, human-induced, and again, we're not talking here harvesting, that's a treatment that's separate here, we're not talking harvesting or other silvicultural activities. And then geologic disturbances, which I don't think there's any record that I recall seeing. This is avalanches, landslides, volcanic blast zones. So maybe if you're out west, these would be the ones that you'd be looking out for. And then that minimum threshold is what classifies as a disturbance, and it has to be at least 0.4 hectares in size, and affecting as either damage or mortality at least 25% of trees. So there's got to be a minimum threshold to trigger this disturbance call. And it can get a little bit more. There's actually a few other things when you start to get into things that aren't so much tree focused, like shrubs and ground layer. I encourage you to go through the field manual if you really want to get all what triggers this call. It's a bit more than this, but this is the bulk of it right here. Okay, so we've got these 28 disturbances monitored, and I just wanted to estimate every single year how much area was impacted. And so methods, I use post-stratified estimation. I used evaluations consisting of the 4 most recent panels. So here's where I'm combining that first study where we don't look at all the panels combined, but we're using the most recent panels. And the reasoning for that, probably a bit more complicated than I want to get into, but at the end of the day, I felt that was the best approach. And again, using that idea from that second paper that, we need to really be careful about what years we're estimating so that we don't end up with severely biased estimates, and applying a lot of that. Using the field-based component. And so this is we're talking plots where people have actually been out in the woods and observed disturbances. And in terms of the domains for the estimation, forest land, Laurentian Mixed Forest, the disturbance agent and year. And there's the results, which shows a large increase in disturbance annually from 1999 to 2015. 2015 is notable for the first year in quite a long number of years where we actually see a drop in disturbance. So talking here's the million acres. And so it's 1999, 1.3%. And in 2015, 11.4% of the forest. So one thing that's new in this paper, and I think is probably, which I feel is probably one of the more important contributions of this paper, and it's the first that I know of where it's been done in this way, is to recognize disturbances as either continuous or discrete. And what does that mean? Well, when the foresters are on the plot and they're doing a call on disturbance, they assign a year of that disturbance. And so, you know, if they're out there in 2015 and it's something that just happened, they might say disturbance year equals 2015. That's a discrete disturbance, like 1 year time span. And so I'm calling those discrete disturbances. What we see in the database, particularly in this Laurentian Mixed Forest database, is a large increase in disturbance year 9999, which means kind of a continual disturbance. So the way I think about that is a disturbance that's occurred since last remeasurement, kind of continually. And those I'm calling continuous disturbance. And so what we see here is this run up in disturbance area is really driven by what's getting classified as continuous disturbance. And I think that's really important because if it's a discrete disturbance, for me, that denotes a whole nother level of severity. That means in that year, 25% of trees damage or mortality in that year. But when you talk about the continuous disturbance, that threshold is actually spread out over many years. And so any one given year, maybe there wasn't much mortality or damage from this agent, but in the second year, it picked up a little bit. But those work their ways into the estimates and they stay in these estimates for quite a long time, these continuous disturbances. So I think this is an important note here to think about when we think about disturbance. Not to say that it, you know, for me, it kind of tempers this a little bit in terms of the severity of this figure. This, you know, when I first plotted this and got all the estimates and checked and rechecked, wow, that, and other researchers using just the FIADB, I noted Wilson and others, very similar kind of finding approach here. So, but these are actual annual estimates. And so I want to take a little bit of that, talk about, excuse me, talk about some of the things we're seeing here. So I've just picked out 3 different disturbance agents. So now we're down to individual ones. And I've picked beaver, deer, ungulate, and wind. And see if we can talk a little bit more about this idea of continuous and what's the general pattern that we're seeing. So here is an individual disturbance that really kind of mirrors that overall trend that we saw. Fairly flat and then a continuous steady run up, okay? And what we actually see is the vast majority of that is continuous disturbance in terms of beaver damage just being, beaver mortality or damage being isolated to one specific year. Most of it's actually being spread out over multiple years between the re-inventories. And there's actually, just taking a look at this general pattern of the 28 disturbances, there were 9 that had a very similar pattern. So it's not just one agent that's driving this pattern. We've got multiple agents that are exhibiting this kind of continuous disturbance nature occurring. A second basic pattern that we see, which differs from this marked increase over the time length here, is a rapid increase and then a dropping down to a more moderate level and holding fairly steady. And this is the deer ungulate. Actually gave a talk a few months ago up in northern Minnesota and showed this figure, and I had a forester come up to me afterwards and says, you know, it was really like around 2000 on the particular agency company land that this person worked. He said, you know, really it was around 2005-06 when we really got serious about bud capping. So obviously that's just one land ownership, and this is, we're talking here an estimate for a whole region, but you do wonder to what extent some of these things start to play in what we're seeing. And then what we see here is wind, and this might be the classic idea of a disturbance, like, right? And so when I produced this figure, I went, phew. Anyone know why I went, phew? So this is estimates of the area disturbed from wind. in the Laurentian Mixed Forest.
Shows the blowdown.
Yes. And so then it's like, okay, that's good. The East Texas case study showed I was getting patterns that I thought, if this estimation is working out correctly. And, it's difficult to confirm this stuff, to be honest with you, in terms of actual numbers. And I'm always looking for evidence to say, is this estimation approach and all these complex formulas and data wrangling, is it producing estimates that conform to what we think? And so I was very glad to see that. And you can see with wind, we're getting, very much this kind of discrete pattern, particularly when we've got the big events. It's like a single storm coming through. And then 2011 and 12 were also noticeable. And so I sent these estimates by state to contacts I have in the States. And I said, could you take a look at this and tell me if this wind estimates match with what you understand to be occurring in your states? And the feedback I got was a forester in Wisconsin sent me, they had a large windstorm just northeast of us, kind of in the very northwestern portions where it kind of reaches the furthest west in Wisconsin, a whole series of counties there. They had a large windstorm event that they actually went out and mapped to assess the damage. It was significant enough that they did that, and they were able to send me the map. And because, I know the locations of these plots, I can confirm that my estimation is corresponding to that geographic area. And so that gave me another that seems good. 2012, when I looked at the data, no one reported back to me about one or maybe a small number of very specific events that might have accounted for most of that. But when I looked at the data, I saw that it was but much more broad spread, like maybe lower intensity storms, but over a wider area. So here are the other disturbances that are exhibiting this broad pattern here. And so in terms of observations, yes, a marked increase in forest disturbance. But again, I think it's important to be thinking about this continuous nature and thinking about maybe that doesn't quite have the same severity as if it was all discrete events. And then thinking about multiple disturbance agents contributing to the pattern and feeling like FI data is actually providing, with this adjustment and methodology, we can get some really good information. I'm by no means saying that NFI, the Natural Forest Inventory, gives us everything we need. It's really a combination of this kind of data with remote sensing and with some of the work people are doing in our department now. They're used together with model-assisted and model-based estimation, and that's really going to be exciting to see some of the results from that. So, but at least just thinking about the FIA database as a standalone inventory data set, it does, I think, some really insightful information, at least if you've got can dive into it and do a little bit of this estimation. I need to give credit to my collaborators. Jim Westfall, who's my primary collaborator with the U.S. Forest Service Northern Research Station, FIA. The second study really was John Colston did the simulation work that was, and this basic idea of recognizing the importance of the retrospective observation. John really took the lead on that. Marcus Taylor was also with us on that study. And then for the earlier Texas study, Paul Ploko, who was also here for a little bit, but now is with Rocky Mountain Research Station, FIA. Jason Vogel, who's at the University of Florida, and Georgianne Moore was at Texas A&M and is now Georgia Southern University. So here are the actual 3 studies. If you would like to learn more about them, I think some of you might be interested in Laurentian Mixed Forest. Here's the paper, it's freely available. I do need to acknowledge my funding. Half my funding comes from the U.S. Forest Service, FIA, Northern Research Station, for which I'm very much enjoy working with my colleagues there, and very appreciative for that support. And also Minnesota Agricultural Experiment Station Project 42-114. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris, really nice job. Is there any way of seeing the extent to which definitional and measurement error plays into this? I go back to that slide of the 26 or 28 different kinds of disturbances, and whether, with characterizing that, or whether it's real disturbance, or whether it's dead trees, what constitutes a dead tree. just having worked on inventory crews, I remember my crew partner and I would oftentimes disagree, like, no, and then one would say yes, the other would say no. So has anyone looked at that, or is there any way of teasing out the extent to which that whole definitional problem and the way it's measured in the field contributes to what we're seeing?
The answer is yes, but it's been a while and it needs to be looked at again. Okay, so let me explain that answer. So first of all, I use the National Forest Inventory data. So this is a large federal program. It takes a lot of training to be qualified to go out and do one of these plots. So, we have highly trained people in the field who are doing a lot of, continuing education to become familiar with these disturbances and how to identify them. They also speak with landowners. We do not trespass. So often if it's on private land, we're speaking to private landowners, and they very well may have a lot of knowledge about when the storm came through or some event. So there's data sources like that. And then, we also have as part of the program, there is a QA/QC that does involve check cruisers going out to a sample of these plots and seeing if they how their assessment of that plot goes with the crews that actually did the production version of it. That's data and information that I think could be updated. It exists, but I'm not aware that it's been summarized and published at a national level, with the exception of a paper that was published in 2009 by Pollard and others. And in there, for example, the disturbance year measurement quality objective is in 99% of the calls to be within plus or minus a year. And so I think it's been a while since I've read that paper, but I do think that is a paper and some methodology that now that we are another 10 to 15 years after that, it would be really good to do something similar to that to make sure, are we still kind of where we think we are in terms of 2009? So the answer is yes, but I think it is something that really should be updated and looked at more closely. Yeah.
The Texas drought is super fascinating. And has anyone worked on species level data for that, Chris? Because it just seems like a rich possibility to look at individual species vulnerability and kind of physiology and project. The drought induced mortality is like a huge hot topic in tree fizz right now.
Yeah, so actually we have a whole nother set of papers where we did do that, and that's not so much that I took the lead on. So the original drought survey that we did, which was probably the largest science thing I've ever done, we had the whole state. I had to produce an estimate how many trees died across the whole state of Texas. It's a big state. So I designed that survey, and we had over a quarter of the Texas A&M Forest Service staff working on it at various parts over a period of like 6 months. So with that, we got a lot of really useful data. I then partnered with colleagues at Texas A&M University, because research is not like it was a big driver in a state forestry agency. So I wasn't going to spend the time to try to publish a paper and get these results out there more broadly, but my colleagues at Texas A&M were. And so Georgianne Moore actually took the lead and did a lot of, and there's a paper that we published, Georgianne's the lead author, back in 2016. It's in Ecological Applications. And if you search more in 2016, or me, Edgar, it's a more uncommon, I guess, you'll probably find it. And then Paul Kloko, who was one of the co-authors, he actually has done a series of papers where we've gotten into species level detail, looking at the impacts on pines, natural versus planted. So yeah, lots of work's been done. There was a team at Duke that did remote sensing. Schwantes is the primary author. So I don't know if there's species level information there, but a lot of their work, as I reviewed, it felt like it conformed pretty well to what we did in our initial damage assessment in terms of the general magnitude of the disturbance. But I don't know if there's been species level information, but Schwantes would be another paper to look, author to look up.
A similar question to that. So we had a drought in 2021. When would you maybe expect to start seeing this kind of thing and using the methodology you have? And then to the question here, the ability to maybe tease apart and say, well, did that event have differential mortality on balsam fir versus something else. When might you be able to use this methodology to start understanding that a bit?
So, yeah, that's a good question. When we have very extreme events, that first year after the drought, after it runs its course, we get the first panel of data. And so we can produce an estimate. And of course, because we've been doing the annual inventory now since in some states, 1999 was the first year we got really going in many states, or 2000, 2001 timeframe. We've got 20, 22, 23 years of observations. And so we could do a before after kinds of comparisons fairly rapidly. The question becomes, is the plot size sufficient for us to tease out, is this significant? And that then is going to be a function of how extreme was the drought. And so, yeah, I remember it was dry here, but I mean, just my personal experience, it does not equate to what I experienced in terms of what I experienced in Texas, where we saw that kind of a print on the data. That's not to say it wasn't important. I'm not saying that at all, or it was, I do wonder if this event was severe enough to trigger that 25% damage mortality threshold. Now, we have another postdoc now, actually working with Rebecca Lucia Fitz. She's done some really good work about thinking beyond just these disturbance codes, getting into the individual tree and thinking about that. And she has a paper published last year looking at alternative ways to characterize disturbance in the FIA data. And that might be a productive avenue. So it depends. I know it's not a satisfactory answer, but that is my answer, I guess. Yeah.
I'll take one from online here from Kyle Gill. Chris, at your SFEC presentation, you mentioned that some of these disturbance agents were not included throughout the time period you surveyed. There and in your paper, you write that you conclude that the addition of agents is not a significant factor in the increased disturbance observed. This still confuses me a bit, so could you speak to which disturbance agents were added at a later time and how that wouldn't impact the estimate of acres impacted by those disturbances?
Yeah, so I can answer that broadly, Kyle. I don't know if I can list off all the specific agents. I definitely want to say the geologic ones, I think, were not part of the original back in 1999. They got added a few years later, but as I already noted, we don't have a lot of geologic events. Ones that were added and that might be, we think, are more prevalent here. And again, I'd have to go back and look at the details. It's been a while, but what I remember stating was the changes that were made to the addition of disturbance agents were done fairly early on in this 23-year time horizon of data that we currently have. And so they got added fairly quick. So it's not like we were adding 3 or 4 in 2005 and another 3 or 4 in 2010 and another 3 or 4 that were all contributing. The additions, the change that occurred in what agents were monitored happened very quickly and have really been settled down now for quite a long time. I can't remember the exact years, but I do remember that being the major finding in that paper was I didn't think the addition of disturbance agents was contributing to it in terms of what we're monitoring.
Yeah, I just have one question. So I'm not super familiar with all the forestry stuff, but I'm glad to kind of follow along. So in your last kind of theme, I guess you presented some of the continuous versus discrete impacts of like if you go back a couple slides, that would maybe help a little bit. So you noted that you kind of validated the discrete disturbances with these derecho or like windfall events, and then for the continuous disturbance, how did you validate that, or is it, do you think that is harder to do beyond outreach and discussions with local residents?
Yeah, that's harder to do in terms of what other data sets out there would give me a sense of beaver damage in the forest. I'm personally not, I mean, maybe I should check with some of my wildlife colleagues to see if they have that, but I'm not quite as familiar. Definitely though, the remote sensing, they really are, there's been a number of papers that have been really getting at not just disturbance has occurred by time and space, but really starting to look at causal agent and doing some work to assign that. So as those develop, then that might give us an additional. But again, it becomes a bit of a challenge to say from a remote sensing source in terms of how they define their disturbance. How does that match up with this 25% of damage or mortality on trees? And so there's always a bit of a definitional, which gets back to this other paper where thinking more broadly about how we define and looking at the full options within. And it really is just this year, and that one, in I guess the absence of any of these bars in other years, is also confirmation that this methodology, but I really am limited to wind as the one that's got that real strong fingerprint. And I can't do a similar kind of, I'm so glad I saw that in these other ones because I don't quite have the data sources that I'm aware of.
Fire.
So the fire would be one that we could do. And we use this remote sensing data set for the true population when we did the simulation study in 2. And so maybe there's more information in there. But again, we get back to this, the triggering of what qualifies as a disturbance agent. There's always a definitional thing there. But at least we might be able to see major increases by year that correspond to what we would expect. So it's a good point. There's probably additional work that we could do or that I could have done to try to really tease it out, but they accepted the paper and didn't ask me to do that.
There's no beaver numbers are going. Beavers in the upper Midwest and whether their populations are growing and expanding. But
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
Tom Burke, yeah, Tom Burke can tell you.
Well, since he retired, maybe. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
well, let's think.